here. I think we've got this. It says that I'm screen sharing. It does not say that it's paused, so we're going to call that good. I again would like to thank Dr. Dunker for the leadership he provided that has allowed us to do this for oh so many years. I'm thinking it was maybe '08 or '09 when we started these. So it's been quite a while now. So with that, the whole concept being to highlight skills demonstrated that are effective and positive leadership. And sometimes, like tonight, we might also show things that are not exactly positive, so that we understand, what the ramifications are. So, are there any other questions from anybody before I go forward?
I just want to share that I'm probably going to just turn off people's cameras just to be safe about making sure that you can advance your slides.
All
So
right.
if I turn off your camera, you didn't do anything wrong, and just trying to help out Russ's
Okay.
bandwidth. Okay.
All right. So here we go. Now, we've already kind of answered this question. We are here to talk about presidential leadership in the 20th century. We discussed TR and FDR last time. And, I guess the question that comes up, what was it that I said they did that allowed them to get their story out? And just as a reminder, they actually provided access. You know, Theodore Roosevelt gave reporters access to the information about what he was planning to do or what he was doing. And, gee, you would think that this is, just standard operating procedure, but in reality, this actually even predates the idea of what we now call press releases. But also, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, if you put out a press release and nobody reads it, does it mean what you were trying to do didn't happen? No, it just means nobody knows about what you were trying to do. He came up with a way to put extra emphasis on it so that they would pay attention to what he was saying. And it was coming from him. This is a big point. By providing the access to himself, he, of course, was enough of a draw because they all knew they would get something they could write about. Now, remember what I'd said. The newspapers were actually uniformly, the big papers were owned by rich people. And, Theodore Roosevelt had a habit of not kowtowing to the rich people. We saw it with J.P. Morgan. We saw it with the coal mine owners. We saw it with the train owners. And then, of course, he takes on the big trusts and everything else. So the newspapers being owned by rich people, the editorial page is uniformly saying bad things about it. But as Steve brought up earlier, the concept that we just heard recently, can you say that the vast majority of the newspapers in America were not disposed well towards Trump, and they would spend a great deal of their editorial pages with statements against that president? Well, as Teddy Roosevelt figured out, we don't really care what's on the editorial page. We care on the message that's coming off the front page that the majority of people read. And he made sure that it was his version of the story that showed up on the front page. And he did that by being the one who supplied all the information. And I mentioned as well that FDR continued this practice and did it very much the same way. The difference being he didn't invite him in while he was getting a shave, so he invited them into an actual formal press conference and would talk to them. But remember what the ground rules were. You could not quote him. You could not say this came from the White House. Why would you say that? Why would that be the case? Because by doing that, it's providing the background to the reporter so that they can make comments on the story when it actually is happening. Well, in reality, then, they're shaping how the story is going to be reported, aren't they? They're at least getting their side of the story out first. And now everything else the reporter learns, he's going to have to balance that against what he was told by the president. So now you can see he's not only shaping which stories, but he's shaping how the story is told. That's a very big thing in how the news is going to reflect on you. Now, remember, in both cases, if you broke those rules, you didn't get access. That's just how it worked. And all of the press members were okay with that. They might grouse about it, but they were okay. They understood the rules up front. And remember that Arthur Schlesinger said, you know, the difference with FDR was he became the news by doing both the background and the actual news story. He totally could shape both the news and the thrust of that news. That's a big deal. Now, I've used the term muckrakers, and I may or may not have told you, Theodore Roosevelt came up with that term, and it was not a friendly term. He meant it in dressing down. He wrote an article himself, which he got published in Century magazine, I think in 2005 or 2000, or excuse me, 1905, 1906, in which he said some reporters were just there to cause trouble. And they did that by raking up the muck, by stirring things up, and they were trying to make a splash. And the idea being that that splash would then splatter on the president or on whoever it was they were against. They were making trouble where trouble does not exist. And, you know, as you see over here, we see, you know, after Taft becomes president, we see the newspapers implying that Taft and Teddy aren't getting along. And, you know, the problem being that in reality, Taft, of course, did not carry on because he didn't have that type of personality. He did not carry on Roosevelt's method of access. Taft disdained the concept of access. He was not the control freak that Teddy Roosevelt was. But because he was not that control freak, it also meant, much like under other presidents who are not as interested in the minutia of their entire administration, things happen that they don't intend. Their department heads go off on their own, heading in their own direction, and they're not aware of some of those directions. And I always loved this cartoon with all the cats playing with all the yarn and making a mess out of things, and Theodore looking in the window going, what have you done? What kind of a mess are you? And of course, that would later on result in, you know, Theodore Roosevelt coming back and wanting his job back, and the fight that would happen because Taft wasn't about to just step down. Now, as I said, though, we call many of the reporters muckrakers because the legitimate reporters that read what Roosevelt had to say took the name up as a badge of honor, and they reveled in the attention. They said, yes, I'm a muckraker. I am trying to make a change. I'm trying to make a difference. And we're proud of that. But at the same time, reporters in general still like Teddy, you know, and a lot of that was the fact that you always knew where you stood with him. You know, he made it very clear. But the bigger part was simply, you know, if Teddy Roosevelt was involved, you were going to sell papers. You were going to get that story in the press, and you were going to make a splash with it. And something that I want to make sure that's clear, and I think it ties into the question that Steve asked. TR and FDR were very secure in their own skins. They were very secure about who they were. They would take, you know, offense at a cheap shot, but because of the access they were giving and because of the respect they were showing all of the journalists, they rarely got cheap shots. And on things like this, they saw the humor in these items. They did not get upset because they weren't being portrayed in a manner in which they wished to be portrayed. They did not take it out on the reporter if the reporter didn't tell the story exactly as they wanted them to. Now, if they induced something into it that implied something different than what they said, that would be a problem. But what we're seeing here is, while the reporters were learning many things from these presidents were also learning things from the reporters. In both cases, and I did not clarify this last week because it was intended to be here. In both cases, as time went on, both TR and FDR, you got to the point where they felt they could tell reporters what to do. They could say this is the way something should be, or more importantly, what they would say is, I don't want that story out. I want that buried. And what they found out was, you could ask that once. You could claim it's a item of vital importance, or you could say that something was wrong with that story. But if they found out that you were really didn't want it out because it didn't suit your needs to be out at that time, if you didn't want it said in that way because, well, that didn't make it quite sound as great as you were trying to present. In other words, if you were trying openly to shape the story in a way that was beneficial totally to you while covering up something false, then there would be repercussions. And what they would really find is you cannot go back to that well repeatedly. You'd better have a legitimate reason for burying the story. You'd better have a legitimate cause for disagreement with that reporter, or it's not going to work. And this cartoon here is one I always like. It's we the people speaking to, a very imperial looking FDR, who's saying, Mr. President, I gave you a big vote of confidence last November, but I didn't give you a mandate to pack the Supreme Court. And FDR learned from that. And the whole reason that TR had put that article in Century Magazine was because some things had come up about the trust busting, and saying you're not busting as many trusts as you imply that you are, and thus, it was needling Teddy Roosevelt. So both of them learned that these are not pets, and they are not bought and owned. They are their own people. And the press has always felt, I did mention this last week, the press, even in their bad times, has always felt that they have a responsibility to the American public to get the truth out there. Now they also have a responsibility to sell stories. But they take that concept that they are the first pass at creating history pretty seriously. So a key point to realize, both TR and FDR had goals. They felt that an informed public would agree with their reasoning. That is a key issue. They did not want it to be told in a certain way because it would benefit them financially or benefit them unreasonably. The benefit they would get is that you would agree with the person. And their whole point was, I'm informing you how I'm thinking. I'm informing you of the background that I'm using to make this decision. And, that's a key thing. And they both learned they needed the public on their side to achieve anything. And that's something that all presidents don't quite learn, or they think they can get it in a different way instead of through agreement, instead of through pulling something together. Now, remember, this was really important to FDR, and it's one of the reasons FDR used, whether it was disingenuous or not, I don't think it really was. FDR used this reasoning as to why he ran in 1940. Remember, he put up person after person that he thought would be a great presidential nominee for 1940. And none of them really had the political side to make that work. And as they all got shot down, he came to realize that, all these things he was trying to get through, because remember, in the aftermath of the Great War, the Congress had pushed very hard to try to become isolationists again, and to prevent America from doing anything that would entangle us in foreign war. And one of those things was a strict neutrality issue. Yet here's FDR talking and watching, realizing that, without help, without American aid, the British are not going to stand up to Hitler. And if they don't stand up to Hitler, who is? How is that going to work? And that it would have a bad impact on us if that happened. Thus, he did not go to extra legal methods. That's a very key point, but he did try to start making the points, especially through the press, as to why we needed to become the arsenal of democracy, why we needed to become involved on a very distant level through Lend-Lease, through sales, etc. And that was, a very winding path that he had to negotiate. He did not feel anybody was going to be able to do that. And remember, what was it, by the fall of 1940, the election year, France is going to fall, to the Germans in a 6-week blitz. I mean, it's just amazing. These folks that had held out through all of the Great War, boom, just gone. And then, of course, the American public starts to take it seriously. And it's at that point they decide not to switch horses midstream, even though we weren't involved yet. Now, here's the question I've got. Did it help that both these men were independently wealthy and they were very comfortable in their knowledge of their own abilities? They were not insecure personalities. I think that made a big difference. And I think that is one aspect that we have seen repeatedly. And if you want to get into what makes a bad president, it's that insecurity that I would argue is the issue one must really worry about. Now, as we'll see, every president has to learn what happens when you choose, rather than to inform, as you saw FDR and TR doing, but to muddy up the story, to muddy up the facts. And you'll notice I'm saying here that, gee, there's some invasion of anti-Castro Cubans, hitting Cuba, and Rusk says the U.S. won't interfere. Remember, there's more to that. We'll get to it. And of course, there are other cases, and I don't know if any of you recognize this building. It's a complex of buildings in Washington, D.C. That happens to be the Watergate complex. There are consequences if you do not learn that choosing to obfuscate will have a high penalty, a very high penalty. So with that, we're up to Presidents of the Press, Part 2. We're going to look at JFK and Richard Nixon. And this is really, just want to tell you a quick story. There were two men. They're in Pennsylvania. It's a spring day in 1947. And they're standing in front of a group of steel workers, and they're debating the issues facing Congress. They're both the first men of the class of 1946, meaning they are veterans that have successfully run for Congress and were both elected in the class of 1946, the election of 46. And they're about to head for DC, and in the process, they get together for this mock debate. It's a real debate, though, and one had a debater's edge. The other was very friendly, almost a little diffident toward his opponent, but the other, that other had a hard edge. Now, the diffident one actually called himself the fighting conservative, while the other one said he was dedicated to practical liberalism. And before the crowd, the practical liberal pushed really hard at his opponent. He was throwing punches, just hitting him on every point, debating every issue. Fighting conservative was kind of staying above all that. He's not directing his at his opponent. He's talking to the crowd. This is a crowd of working men. And this really amazed the organizer, because the organizer felt that the fighting conservative was too gaunt, he was too thin, aimed his answers at the workers, but geez, he's a rich kid. While the practical liberal was really fit and seemed to be a real fighter, he was really pushing at his opponent. Yeah, note that in case you can't read it, it's John F. Kennedy who calls himself the fighting conservative, and it's Richard Nixon calling himself the practical liberal. Yeah, that's right. You know, and one of the things that the organizers said was you would not know which one was born into the upper class and which one had worked his way up from the way they're acting. You would almost think it was the opposite. So that's kind of a big thing. But he also mentioned what was really striking was how friendly they were with each other, and the crowd liked them both. And there's a reason for that, with very few exceptions. Really and truly, they were both kind of centrists, despite their names. It was really only the big difference between them was the party they belonged to. Now, this was going to be their first debate, but it was not going to be their last by a long shot. And in fact, both of them would serve together for 2 years in the House of Representatives. At that point, the practical liberal would move up to the Senate seat. Uh, so, but he wouldn't complete that because then he was going to move into the vice presidency. You know, um, we have more to say about that in a moment, but let's consider these things. We talk about leaders having the skills that allow them to succeed as president. I want to make sure that you remember these. It's insight, which is to correctly define the issues. In other words, the things that matter to people, and to see a path that overcomes these issues, and to be able to communicate that path, that vision. So being able to communicate that is the biggest issue. And they have to have the resolve to see it through. If they are the type that just goes here and there and back and forth and everywhere else, and the vision is not one that is inclusive, that works for everybody, then they're not a good leader. And we have seen that, right? So business leaders recognize those same skills. And that's one of the reasons we're talking about this. And it's not just business leaders. Aren't these skills going to help you in life, no matter who you are, no matter what job you have? That's why we talk about this. So here are the things I want you considering while we're talking about tonight's class. Haven't things changed? Why would we look at people over a century ago and how they worked, or in our case now, 50 to 60 years ago, about how they worked with the press? Heck, the press has changed. It was a metal device that was pushed down against paper to transfer word to the page. Jeez, nobody makes papers that way anymore, right? How did radio, and now for tonight's class, how did TV change what newspapers were doing? Because still, out of all these, which one goes into the most depth? Which one of those three? And now we can add the fourth. What about the internet and Twitter with its 64 letter statement, Now, are there differences between Nixon's use of news and Kennedy's use of news? I think that's something important. And that's another way of saying, do leaders have to adapt to those changes we were just talking about as media changes? So, does media change as time goes on? Remember, I said that there was a bit of a change because Teddy Roosevelt had helped them attain a concept of a press corps. Here were just these guys that wanted questions answered standing outside the executive office building, trying to shout questions. And even if it's raining, trying to get somebody to talk to them. He gave them a location inside his new West Wing building that he was coming up with, and the chance to actually be able to talk to government officials, to ask their questions. Now, one of the things that is happening in the early part of the 20th century, we talked a little bit about Joseph Pulitzer, that it's his fight for readers with Hearst as they're both trying to make their paper the big paper in New York City. It's their fight that historically has come to be blamed for all the sensational reporting that led to the Spanish-American War. Each was trying to top the other, right? And we talked a little bit about that last time. Here's the thing we need to remember. He has gone ahead and he wants to redeem the news. He's had a change of heart. You know, it's more important that news be factual. And so as he dies, he leaves money to create a set of awards. And he also has money available even before his death to start creating what are called journalism schools in college to teach good reporting, i.e. based on facts, how to find those facts, how to create good stories, readable stories, and how to check those facts to make sure you're what you're being told, even if the person telling you that is the president of the United States, right? So he helps fund the prizes at pushing for great journalism. But remember, journalism now no longer just means newspapers, right? And there's a guy that has come along that's come up through news, but it's his radio broadcast from 1940 in London during the air raids, you know, broadcasting to America and telling them about the things that the British are facing and surviving to continue to fight the good fight, you know, to stand up to Hitler and all the things that he stands for. And those radio broadcasts now, of course, are classic, but tomorrow news was a calling. And the big thing is anybody could make something moving. It had to be honest. It had to be real. And that was his side of the truth of news. And he demonstrates through these broadcasts, he just demonstrates the sheer power, you know, that the immediacy of radio coming into your home can bring. And he recognizes how dangerous that power could be. And he dedicates himself, you know, to demonstrating the responsibility of news organizations and inspiring practitioners, you know, these folks that are creating history. It's the first pass at history. It's the historians that are going to look at it, maybe judge it, but these are the guys writing it down as it happens. And he tries to fill people with the need to do their very best. He's very successful at it. He demands truth, demands professionalism, and his efforts are unflinching no matter how much difficulty they cause him. And I also want you to think about this. Is the First Amendment still necessary? You know, we've said the press is protected by the Bill of Rights, most state constitution. And of course, you know, it says, I'm pretty positive, it just says, thou shalt make no laws, right? Well, Congress shall make no laws. So that they don't, right? And we have also said that leadership requires certain skills. Are those skills the same? Has something changed to make, you know, do you have to be a different person than you were in 1900 than you were in 1940 than you were in 1960? You have to be a different person to make use of those of the media, to make successful use of the media. Do we need to be talking about a new skill here? These are the things I want you considering, okay? So we've said they have to adapt. And of course, think about it. Here's Richard Nixon, born in 1913. So he's going from newspapers to radio to television in his lifetime, right? Now, remember, this guy grew up too poor to make it to a big name college, even though he was, you know, phenomenally intelligent and smart at school. But he does make it to Duke Law School, largely on scholarships and also working. He's almost an FBI agent. He really wanted to. He's a true believer in law and order, by gosh, and had the chance, but it just, you know, he thought he better stick to stuff. He's becoming a lawyer. It actually kind of lost his application. By the time they came back, he'd already passed the bar. And he's like, nah, I'm not. And he makes the most important and smartest step of his life. He does marry Pat, and that truly does more for him than anything else. He enlists like most men did at that time. Duty called. He's no longer going to be in Washington. He's going to be in Iowa. In my mind, I'm probably wrong about this, but I keep thinking he gets assigned to Dubuque, Iowa, which is not the combat post he was looking for. I remember, as I said, he grew up poor, and you see himself and the siblings there. His younger, one of them will die of tuberculosis. His mother is going to take that child and move away to a drier climate, hoping to get better. And that departure really causes him a lot of grief and insecurity. He had a lot of tough times growing up. He grew up poor. That's all there is to it. But remember, as he's coming of age, now he does get transferred to the South Pacific, but it's not in a fighting position. He's really a quartermaster, a great poker player. But the reality is that as he comes home and he's really looking at the concept of going into what he calls the arena, he's in a hurry. And he's a great public speaker. As you can see here, he's got it figured out. New concept. Pulls into a town, steps up on the back of the station wagon drop door there, and makes his speech. Has a little microphone with a speaker on top, so he's able to do this. And he draws a crowd. And he's talking about a lot of things. Of course, one of the big things he's talking about are the same things Churchill was talking about: the threat of communism. That's a key concept here. Remember, we've had the situation. The Soviets have backed out of their agreement on Poland, and remember that the British and the French went to war with the Nazis because of their invasion of Poland. Now here, after the war, one of the allies is saying, no, they can't have their own government. They're not going to have free elections yet. We just can't handle that yet. So in a lot of ways, a lot of people feel, there's some failures there. But throughout all this entire time, gets elected, but communism is the big issue, isn't it? There's this worry that there are commies in government, there are commies everywhere you look. There are charges by somebody who was a communist who had gone on to be an editor at Time magazine, who now comes out. Of course, he's entirely trustworthy to make these. His name is Whittaker Chambers. He's a former communist, but he makes a charge against the man who was in the FDR New Deal, who was going on to the World Bank, Alger Hiss, that he too was a member of the Communist Party, and Hiss denies it. But that becomes a touchstone, a flare point. At the same time, then, here you've got Nixon leading that, and another guy sees how big a name Nixon is making doing that. So this guy's name is McCarthy, and he makes a charge shortly thereafter. I have here in my hand a list of 205 members of the State Department known to be communist sympathizers. But just like we saw with Teddy Roosevelt last week, one of the key things about Richard Nixon was he was very good at self-promotion and always getting himself in front of the news. And here they are investigating those films found in the pumpkin patch. So remember as well that all of a sudden everybody is looking for communists everywhere. And one of those great cartoons, whatever happened to freedom from fear? Because remember, that had been one of the big points in one of FDR's first speeches. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. And then goes on that there's one of the 4 rights is to be free of fear. And remember, this is This is the 1950s. This is how prevalent it was. Prevalent it was. This ad, which has an entire set of instructions below it, is in an advertisement in the back of a 1951 high school yearbook. How and what to tell a communist, so it's a big. Now, as I said, Nixon had made the jump to the Senate, and then after 2 years in the Senate, with his success on the Alger Hiss case, the GOP says, I need somebody younger, and boy, this communism issue is a big deal. This is who we want as your vice president. They say, yep, Dick is our boy. But a last minute revelation turns everything upside down, because it appears that there's a slush fund. There's, Nixon didn't have much money, and these wealthy businessmen who thought he should run for the Republican seat and run against these pinkos that the Democrats were putting up, according to them, California, they had been saying, well, we understand you don't have much money, and off the books, they had provided a slush fund. Now, Nixon's point that makes him so really angry is everybody does that. Well, really, he wouldn't know if everybody does that. He's told they do. But now that this has come out, and it's clearly not legal, because of course he's not declaring any of it for taxes, and we remember that's what got Al Capone put away, right? All this money that he wasn't paying taxes on. It annoys Ike. Ike believes that everybody should be squeaky clean, and he wants to dump Nixon because he also doesn't like the guy. He just flat out doesn't really like the guy. And he tries to dump him. And Nixon makes an end around. Television is just coming in, and Nixon says, he goes out, he takes some money. Now, where he gets that money, it's hard to say, but he takes that money and he creates a moment in time, and on a set that looks like it's supposed to be his office, and he gives the famous Checkers speech. And what this speech will teach him is that the national press, the message he takes from it, the national press is harmful to him. Now, I'm going to see if I can make this work. I'm not going to guarantee it. So if you guys want to just take a moment, it's going to take me a second, see what we can do. Hang on. That's it. All right. Don't necessarily see that it's going where I want it to go, so we're going to take it down. And I will just talk through it. And what I'll do is just what I did last week, which is I will send you the links to all of these in a letter in the next day or so. So here we go. Let's see if I can get this. All right, nice little break there. Can anybody tell me if you see the Nixon?
Yep.
It's back?
Yep, Nixon's 1950s.
Yep. So the Checker speech would teach him what he goes on and he gives this very moving and emotional statement where he reads the family's entire net worth and all their bills. And the fact is, it comes out to where we're just pitifully poor. And then goes on to say that Pat, and he almost breaks up and loses it. Pat doesn't have a mink coat. Pat has a good Republican cloth coat. I think she looks great on it. And then, of course, the where it gets its name is he says there was one gift we were given that I'm not going to give back, and that's they gave my daughters a dog, and is a cocker spaniel, and he's named Checkers, and I'm not giving him back. And the thing is, for a moment he thinks he's failed because there's no noise, no anything, but they had shut the phones off while he was recording. They open the phone lines up, and it's an outpouring from the American public that they just love him. That he's just like one of them. Now, the only person who didn't feel that way was Ike. Ike detested the entire thing. To him, sharing and showing your emotions was totally off base. You did not do that. But it was too late by that point. The public had given its approval. The calls and the telegrams were massively in Nixon's favor, and Ike is stuck with him. They do not have a close relationship. And in fact, I had said that Nixon and Kennedy would go on to be friends while they're, because once Nixon gets to be vice president, his office is right across the hall from Kennedy's. And when Kennedy decides to get married, he of course invites Nixon, and Nixon is going to come, but all of a sudden, Ike gives him a first time in that entire 4-year period. Ike invites him to golf with him out in Colorado, and Nixon's not passing that up, so he misses Kennedy's wedding. But that just kind of gives you the hint. Nixon and Ike were not close. Now remember, and I'm going to go back here. Ike went from the military to the presidency, and he did it very successfully. He makes that transition easily. But there is one important difference. Ike, feels we are in a battle with the communists, much like everyone else. Remember, Truman had started the concept of containment. The Republicans were outraged, saying, no, we need to roll them back. Ike is no idiot. He knows nobody's rolling back all those divisions, of the Red Army that successfully stopped and defeated, what at the time was the greatest war machine that ever been created, the Nazi army. Ike embraces clandestine operations. And remember, if you're in a war, as he was in World War II, he did not share all his news with the press. And as far as he was concerned, they were still in a war, and he still wasn't going to be sharing the news with the press. Now, something we always forget, everybody, especially Truman gave him a lot of grief, going, well, I can't wait to see how he's going to make out. He's never had to deal with politics. And Ike just snorted and said he survived and thrived in the most political organization in America, the U.S. Army. And he also embraced the idea that it was important not to let the enemy know your real plans. Unfortunately, what that also meant, you didn't let your friends know your real plans either. He employed what he called the hidden hand method of leadership. He would have others bring forth the issues, and then judging on how they were received would be a yay or nay as to whether or not he acknowledged them or jettisoned those ideas, even though it might have been his idea to start with. Now, he uses covert forces to destabilize communist elections. Right there, you're getting into a gray area. Was it an election? Well, we don't believe the communists have fair elections, so that was easy. But as time goes on, that becomes a
Okay, so Russ has frozen for me. I'm wondering if he's frozen for anyone else. Someone could.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Janice. Just give us a sec. We'll see what to do.
probably put in charge. I wanted Nixon off the ticket. You know, that's all there is to it. So hang on just a second here. Okay, can anybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. I'm
You
sorry.
Yep, you froze for just a little bit, but now you're back.
All right, sorry. Well, Ike and Nixon did not mesh. Ike had his heart attack. Ike wanted Nixon off the ticket before the 56 election. And he tried everything he could to dump him, except for one thing. He would not order him to leave. He would not personally ask him to leave. And Nixon, knowing that Ike did not like that kind of face-to-face confrontation, pushed it to that point. So in the end, Nixon will stay, and he becomes the front runner then for 1960, because it was very clear that, you know, while Ike might go another 4 years, he wasn't likely to break tradition and go for the other. In fact, he can't, can he? The Congress has passed a law that says, nope, only 2 terms now, and it passed that before Truman had left. So there we go. Now, at the same time, 1957, a big thing happens in a very small package. It's a tiny beep, beep, beep coming from space. It's going to cause a drastic change in the world. It's Sputnik, and the space race has begun. And that's because we in the West had believed all of our scientists had said, oh, you couldn't put anything bigger than a bowling ball into space. What good is that? Well, Sputnik wasn't a lot bigger than a bowling ball, but it also had enough room in it to have a radio transmitter. And the radio transmitter was really there just to let everybody know where it was, and not just the communists, but to let everybody else know it was up there. They had stole a march. They had gotten ahead. Now, what do we care about something being in orbit? Well, remember, there have been some changes. There's been a massive arms buildup. And with the arms we're talking about, while you might not be 100% accurate falling out of space to hit a target, you could get within a mile. And honest to gosh, with the weapons of this era, you know, a miss by a mile is as good as a hit. Now, here's just some aspects here. This is how much things have changed by 1960. The U.S. has 700,000 troops around the world. U.S. spending in defense is completely up. The irony is the real change that applies to this class is that Americans, now realizing that it is possible, will make it possible. And what are they going to put into orbit first? And they will be in orbit by 61 or 62. And that's communication satellites. And, you know, if you park them out there at the right spot, 3 satellites can cover the world. And thus you can have near instantaneous communications throughout the world. Now, remember, as I said, Nixon is really, really good at self-promotion. And we're getting into the late 50s, and goes over to see Moscow's great their version of a world fair, and they show this modern kitchen. This is the American modern kitchen. And of course, Khrushchev and everybody else is saying, oh, that's no, not every American has that. And of course, Nixon is there, and they have the great kitchen debate. Now, the irony is, of course, what we see in the papers are just like this. And this is so Nixon. When the cameras are on them, he's all stern and fingers tapping on the chest. And Khrushchev's okay with that. He knows exactly how this game is played, and he plays it the same way. But when the lights are off, Nixon can be very nice and diffident and just one of the guys. But then you turn a camera on him, he's going to make sure that it looks like he's the one tough on communists. He's all smiles and warmth until that starts running. But remember, there's other things happening around the country. There was a failed coup in the late 1950s. Fidel Castro and his brother are jailed. He's tried, but then he's released from jail. He returns back to the attack, and when they're, stomped again, he and his guerrillas take the mountains. But eventually, they're going to be victorious. Now the thing is, America's always been in favor of revolution, so Ike is certain Castro can be controlled. But, there's just something going on there, and not everybody's all that sure about it. And then, of course, Castro embraces communism, socialism, and one of the first steps they will do, of course, is they will nationalize the sugar cane factories. They will nationalize the other factories, and of course, most of those are owned by American business. So it turns out Ike is wrong, and immediately, it's toward the end of his term, but immediately they begin plans for what is called the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which they're going to do something similar to what Castro had done, but the real intention is to, have American forces standing by to step in. So we've got a lot of things happening just in 1959, as you can see here. Just to put your mind into it, Castro's taking power. Some guys die in a cornfield in Iowa. Some guy named Barry Gordy borrows $800 and starts a company called Motown. Spaceships suddenly get into orbit. There's lots of new things, but that's not all that's new. An Iowa farmer invites Khrushchev to America to see how corn is actually produced here, and Khrushchev comes along, and Khrushchev proves that he's pretty darn good with the media as well. He makes the most of his time in the spotlight while he's here in Iowa. He'll go and make nice with Ike, and everything seems fine. Ike is happy with thaw, and they're preparing for a full peace summit in 1960. But on the very eve of that meeting, a U-2 flight is passing over Russia, and the U.S. is denied doing this while the Russians have complained all the way through. And the Russians are not supposed to be able to shoot it down, but on May 1st, 1960, they do. It's a big deal because Khrushchev goes on TV to complain about U.S. spying and shows some of the wreckage. Ike, has been assured by the CIA that first it couldn't be shot down, but if it was, it'd be totally destroyed. You don't have to worry about the pilot. There's no way he'd survive. And if he did, he's got suicide materials. So Ike tells the press and he tells all the world it's a weather balloon, not a spy plane. But Khrushchev has the pilot and it's alive. It's Gary Powers, contrary to all the assurances, he was there. That thaw is over, and a bellicose USSR with both nukes and missiles are now playing the media game. And we see Khrushchev here at the UN. He takes his shoe off, he's pounding the podium, knowing he will get the attention of the world media, and of course tells America, we will bury you. Your children will speak Russian. So it's a tough time. It's 1960 and things are tough, but remember, the torch is passing to a new generation. It's to the Americans who lived through and fought in World War II. And nearly 2/3 of all American males between the ages of 18 and 35 were active servicemen. The youngest are now in their 30s, the oldest are 50, and those are the ones that are now pushing to be the new leaders. Here's two of them, and they're both contenders for that top spot, that top crown in U.S. American politics. Now, Kennedy also has been learning about media and using a new technique. Now, remember, Kennedy should be nowhere close to the top. Nixon had been pushing himself and setting himself up, and for 10 years, he's been putting in place. Kennedy isn't seen as that type of guy. In fact, he's known more as a playboy and a good-looking guy. Everybody knows he might be serious about it. Everybody that knows him likes him and feels he could be the guy. But there's all these people in the Democratic Party ahead of him. He doesn't have a chance. Kennedy will use new techniques in media that turn a personal appearance into a media event, greatly magnifying its power. And by starting to use something the progressives have pushed for, the idea of a primary to decide, not the smoke-filled back rooms, but the idea that primaries can decide. Now, nobody's using primaries for that purpose. They've got a few states have them, and Kennedy decides to enter them and run them. You know, LBJ, who's positive he's going to be the next president, has been making all the deals. But it's Kennedy that says, I'm going to the people and we're going to let them decide. And he tells the people that's why he's running in these primaries. And you know, the Americans like that concept. Prior to that, it was just whoever actually ran, you know, who got the nod in those smoke-filled back rooms. So Kennedy and Nixon end up being the guys. They are chosen, and it's a great surprise. And of course, that gives Kennedy a big oomph. And then the other oomph that goes with it, he gets paired with LBJ. LBJ amazingly accepts Kennedy's offer to be Kennedy's vice president. So, you know, Kennedy has some things going for him, but he's still the underdog. Richard Nixon, of course, is allied with Ike. Everybody loves Ike, although Ike's taken a lot of hits, you know, ever since that very public disgrace of being caught lying on television, of having all his peace initiatives shot down quite literally in 1960. It's a tough time, and it's November. And there's one other thing, and this is a piece that Nixon takes home. The economy is stalling out. It's going into a slight recession. And Nixon, you know, kept saying you need to release more money from the Fed. And of course, Ike is saying that's not what we do. You know, recessions are a part of life. So things are, it's not a real recession, but things are tighter. So it's going to be Kennedy and Nixon. And Nixon, positive he's the better master of the media, quite willingly agrees to meet Kennedy for a televised debate. Remember, television has just come into its own. Television is now huge. By 1959, 99%. And it's a very rapid growth to 99%. 99% of American households have a television and they use them. That's a big deal. Now, of course, the media itself, though, hasn't quite caught on to its power, because this is really one of the first events that's going to test its power. And this newspaper tells us Nixon and Kennedy will meet face to face on TV. Oh boy, there we go. It's a media event, much like Kennedy had been using all along. Whatever he did, you know, make a personal appearance into something huge. So it's going to be Kennedy and Nixon in their debate. Now, these pictures are from, they do 4 debates. So this last 2 pictures are from the second, third, second, fourth. But these next ones are out of the first one. And they just kind of show a lot of how things go. And notice Nixon wiping the sweat from his face. Nixon does not come off. He's been in the hospital. He's exhausted himself because he had made a pledge that he was going to visit all 48 states, you know, and campaign in all of them. His phlebitis acts up. He's been in the hospital, comes out of the hospital just for this debate. He's lost a lot of weight. His suits are a little baggy, and he looks pretty gaunt. Whereas Kennedy looks pretty good, as you can tell. And of course, again, you got that, hey, we're buds. But here's the interesting thing. On this newspaper, you really probably can't read it, but it says initial joust finds, in the debate has nothing, no sharp clashes over issues. In other words, the newsmen who are in the know are saying there wasn't much there. They're telling us it was a non-event, the newspaper. Neither man scored any hits. Now, it goes down in history that radio listeners think Nixon is the winner because, just listening to the audio, it sounded like he made the better points, although, even that, there was no real polling at that time. It was very informal. But TV's the hot new media. And, with all the houses having televisions and they're using them every day, they tell a different story. What they really tell is that Kennedy has won this debate, that he looked good. Now, in reality, what he really proves is just that he is as up on the issues and as qualified and as skilled as Nixon. And that is a lot. Nixon supposedly has, of course, been close to the seat of power now for the last 8 years. Was a big name before that. Suddenly that edge is shrinking. And of course, Ike, up to this point, has not embraced Nixon because he didn't really like him. Ike will, in the last 2 weeks, finally come out heavily for Nixon, but it's too late. And he only comes out heavily for Nixon because, as far as he's concerned, Kennedy insulted him with the charge of a missile gap, and is saying that Kennedy knows there is no missile gap. Well, that's not necessarily true. Remember, to be blunt, Ike plays the hidden hand. He doesn't let these things out. So, in reality, Kennedy wins. It takes all night. The margin is razor thin, less than 0.5 percentage point. These two are pretty much alike on the surface of things. Just described them. Two young naval vets from World War II, about the same age. Kennedy's a little younger. They'd held 3 more debates, but again, there were no knockouts. But Kennedy's proven he's a steady hand, and people like him. That's the key thing that comes out of this. People like Kennedy. Now, Nixon finally concedes, and TV's there to capture that pain. In January, he has to announce his own defeat in the House or in the Senate because he's president of the Senate. So, as we saw, it's the president of the Senate that has to read the results of the Electoral College. So, now Kennedy's victory, as I said, is razor thin, but an interesting thing occurs in the process of the transition, with all eyes on this photogenic young man. Suddenly, his personality starts winning over the voters. His seriousness, his devotion to what he's doing, and then the people he's picking. Remember, he, is going to govern a country where half of the people, minus 0.5%, voted against him. So what he does is his cabinet is equally made up of Republicans and Democrats. He chooses people from the other side. And he knows many of them well. Some of them he doesn't know at all, but he turns to the old hands and listens to them. And in that process, as they're seeing him work and go through the motions and be so intelligent about things, voters are won over by him, just as the press has been. Because why? He has always been open with the press, following much in the footsteps of FDR, of TR. He's very much into the concept that, you have to do both. And we see the difference. At the very end, Ike will give his famous farewell speech where he warns about the military industrial complex, which is also true. But here's what Kennedy looks like at that point, and you can see how much of a difference there is, and that's exciting too, because remember, this is the group that's coming into power. These are the young people. You've got this tremendous baby boom that is now just becoming teenagers, coming of age, and it's this whole feeling of youth and the celebration of youth. But charisma hadn't been a common word in America or in American politics, but by the inauguration in 1961, it's the word repeatedly used to describe JFK. Now, Kennedy does something incredible. He starts with live press conferences. He's going to hold 64 live press conferences with over 400 to 500 reporters in the room asking questions. With 64 press conferences, essentially, he's going to hold a press conference on the average every 2 weeks, a little bit over that, and responds to the questions. Takes them on. Some of them he ducks, and what really comes off is he ducks it with self-effacing humor. In other words, he's willing to poke fun at himself. He's willing to make good-natured jabs at his own administration, and also to take the heat when necessary. And that heat's going to come up really quickly, because Ike was right about the growing military-industrial complex, and anybody that's trying to shut that down is going to have problems. But Kennedy's moving quickly, and one of those things he moves quickly on is they come to him and say, Ike came up with this idea. It's a great idea. The exiles, Cuban exiles, are going to go back into Cuba. Now, we really should do some other things to help. Kennedy agrees. He's not thrilled on one level, but he agrees as long as any other American support is a no-go. He makes it very clear. No, they go in, they're on their own. We'll get them there. We'll train them. We'll supply them. We'll get them there. But once they're there, they have to take care of themselves. And this teaches Kennedy an awful lesson. They'll tell him what they want to tell him, assuming that he's going to cave and do what they want when the time comes. Remember that the original invasion plan had called for airstrikes against Cuban air bases to keep those planes undercover, to keep them from supporting Castro's forces. The reality is that it just goes badly before it even gets started. Now, one thing you need to know, it was not an open secret, but it was not well hidden. These men were in Honduras training. They were training the CIA people, and newspapers started to pick this up, and Kennedy leaned on them to keep it quiet. And then, of course, it all goes badly. And now the newspapers are saying, had we been up front, maybe we would have stopped this. Now, Kennedy's privately outraged, just at the expectation that he'd be manipulated by the military. Instead, he goes to one of his press conferences and accepts blame. First he tries to he just says, I've already said everything I'm going to say about this. I will send you this link. But says he's quite serious. He's already talked to Ike. Of course, Ike has chewed him out of one side and down the other. Because Ike says, well, I backed it. Kennedy's like, that's not right. So now it's just a question. And Ike closes ranks behind Kennedy, as do all the other presidents. So key issue is that Kennedy, when pushed at that press conference, makes the statement, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. And as the executive officer of this administration, I am the one to blame. And it's clear that he's upset. It's clear that he's mad. But that goes a long ways, both with the press and the American people, into convincing them that Kennedy truly learned something from this, and he certainly did. Now, what it all means is that first, Castro has reinforced his leadership in the country. He's had a great victory, and his people are even more behind him. But he's also convinced the U.S. will continue to want him gone, and thus he grows closer and closer to the USSR. And the USSR is pushing Kennedy at every step. They create the Berlin Wall in '62, and then all of a sudden we get into a year later, after the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's that point where the Soviet Union secretly deployed a nuclear strike force in Cuba. It's just 90 miles from the United States. Missiles completely changes the calculus of everything, because those missiles could reach U.S. cities in less than 5 minutes, no longer 20 minutes, no longer giving time for that mutually assured destruction, to occur. So it is a big deal. Now, here's the key issue that I want you to realize. We always talk about the lessons Kennedy learned and that he applies them here, but we also have to realize one of those lessons that we don't talk about is his understanding of the American people and their need for reliable and honest communications. Now, he keeps things under wrap, which does bother the press a little bit, for a few days while they're trying to decide what their response is going to be. Do we go in and try and knock these missiles out, invade the country? Do we acquiesce? Do we say, do we threaten? What is going to be our response? But he chooses the method and the way that seems the most reasonable. And about a week later, he announces finally to the public what's going on, and announces with no uncertain terms that it should be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Suddenly, he is calling Khrushchev's bluff, and it's a very big deal. Now, my point is, he successfully uses his communication style to communicate with the American people, and they're completely behind him. At the same time, he has still many other things going on. Civil rights is another one of those. He goes on the air and on the line to stand behind the rights of the Negroes in America and trying to push America and calling on a new Civil Rights Act. All of these things show his ease with the press. They show his ease with the American public. And he stepped up and set a standard that's going to be the standard for the next 50 to 60 years. We had said originally FDR would be a hard act to follow. Kennedy becomes the tough act to follow. LBJ can't handle it. He fails really completely with the press and thus the public, and is all but hounded from office at the end of his election, his 4 years that he'd been elected. But in '68, Nixon will win, and he does so with a skillful use of the media. He's got smart guys. Kennedy had done a lot of interesting things. Nixon and his people package and sell the presidency like it's a pack of cigarettes, like it's a stick of gum. It is a media blitz, and it's terribly effective, and it uses a lot of the subtleties that are not necessarily good ones. Calling for law and order, which of course means knocking heads of those damn protesters, those long-haired hippie freaks, or those black people who have the audacity to be saying that they're not treated fairly. Now, we got to remember, Nixon was nominated on a national party ticket more times than anybody except FDR, and with only one case did he lose. That was 1960. But we also have to realize that, like Ike before him, Nixon believed in secrecy. He believed in it really more than Ike. Ike believed in it on a military level. Nixon believed in it on a lot of things. And just as we saw that issues started to come up that confronted Kennedy immediately, just months after his inauguration, Kennedy had to face the Bay of Pigs. Well, think about the fact that Nixon, in reality, will have his inauguration. He's already engaged in secret Cambodia bombing missions, and he's ordering FBI wiretaps to find out who's leaking the fact that they're doing these Cambodia bombings. All of this has issues because somebody somewhere is denying that to the press. Somebody somewhere is not talking about it. And of course, Nixon is not open to the press. Nixon tries to stay away from the press. And in fact, he puts in place as his press secretary, unlike everybody back to FDR, he puts a former carnival barker from Disneyland in charge of his press corps, a young kid who really knows nothing and thus cannot accidentally reveal anything because they're not trusting. And Nixon also embraces the Southern strategy, which is his way of making sure he's looked at the fact that Wallace won the entire South by basically saying, the equivalent of segregation now, segregation forever. He's making it clear by the things he's doing. He nominates known segregationists to the Supreme Court. They're turned down by the Senate. That's an amazing difference than what would happen today, most likely. But he's sending the messages that he will go easy on the South on all these things Kennedy's been pushing them to achieve. He does put Warren Burger in. He has amazing successes. He's got Warren Burger that's going to take over the Supreme Court. In a very short period, he's going to have 4 people that he puts on the Supreme Court. Apollo 11, planned to be a celebration for Kennedy or for Johnson. Apollo 11, which had got delayed, the Apollo problem the year before, it lands on the moon in July of his first year. He almost passes the Family Assistance Plan, the most liberal plan ever to come out of Washington. He's got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act that Kennedy had pushed for. He gets that through. And he pushes for Vietnamization, and he's drawing down the number of troops in Vietnam. But what he's not telling anybody is he's escalating the war at the same time with secret bombings. He signs law for tax reforms, defense appropriations, and he helps create the EPA. Now, a lot of this, he's not involved in any of it. His entire issue is all he cares about is foreign affairs. There's an overwhelming Democratic majority. He's not providing leadership to the Republicans at all. The Democrats are saying, hey, we'll make our own deals. We'll get it done. And they do. But they include the Republicans in it. And Nixon does have a vision, and he executes it well. He will create the original détente. He will bring China and Russia to the table by playing them against each other. And in doing so, we can look at it today and say he truly changed the world by bringing China out. I'm not sure if anybody's going to thank him for it at this point. But at the same time, while he's opening doors, he opens a few too many. One of them, while they're looking for a leak as to who it is that's letting the Pentagon Papers out, which he really should have wanted out since it shows just how badly the Democrats had angled the concept of the Vietnam War from the start. He's afraid of what they might find out about what he did in '68 to ensure that he got elected by promising the South Vietnamese that they would have a better chance with him. And they should wait and turn down the peace talks. But in trying to stop these leaks, the plumbers unit, that's why they call them plumbers, go forward and burgle offices, one of which is Ellsberg's, the guy who is leaking the papers, Ellsberg's psychiatrist. All clearly illegal and a problem. They don't stop there, though. As we showed with that Watergate building, they will burgle the Watergate complex to bug actually bug the Democratic headquarters because Nixon is positive. What he's really afraid of is that Teddy Kennedy, he's definitely afraid of the Kennedys, that Teddy Kennedy will be the person running against him in 68 or in 72, and he wants to make sure that he can do everything he can to get the bad news out there for them. But he survives all this, and he's reelected in 72. He comes up with the peace in 73. He survives the Arab-Israeli war and helps push back against Soviet involvement in that. Thus, the Israelis win, and in the retribution, the rest of the Arabs then call an oil embargo. But in all of this, he's working and is successful. Now, the reality is he has decided he's not doing press conferences. He doesn't like how he's treated. So he does television addresses. And of course, all that manages to do is he's doing the same thing that his mind that FDR JFK did, which is go over the newspapers and the press directly to the people. But the difference is FDR and JFK still gave access to the press so that they were involved and knew the thinking behind it. Nixon, plays the hidden hand concept. He's not telling anybody anything. And if he does, it's probably not actually his real thinking. He also greatly increases the frequency of these Oval Office addresses. And that means no questions, no time, but he really overdoes it. My memories of those years, it seemed like he was on constantly and got to the point nobody cared. He was averaging 9 a year. That's twice what just about everybody else did on the average. The only difference is he had no press conferences or next to none, and that meant very little news, only direct statements by him and nothing else. Now, his final Oval Office address would be August 8, 1974, in which he announces his resignation. He was forced by Congress with his own tapes to reveal that he had knowingly authorized the cover-up of Watergate. They had successfully erased the tape that probably had him authorizing the burglaries. So both of those are realities. And why did he have a tape? He wanted a record of all the things he had done so nobody else could say, no, I came up with that idea or I thought that. Again, it's that basic distrust that he seemed to have of everybody in every institution. And Nixon was the master of the media for his time, but he did it with calls on people's trust. And that's going to crash down around his ears when it's his own voice on the tapes that reveal that he's lying at the same time that he's asking for your trust. That's the thing the American public really can't handle. They can handle if you're lying for good reason, but you knowingly lie to them just because you don't want to tell them the truth, that becomes a bigger thing. And that's going to get us down to the wrap up. We've got to get back to these questions that I'd asked to start with. Have things changed? Why are we looking at people over a century ago? I would say this. One of the things, why did the media continue to pursue Watergate after Nixon assured them that it was nothing? Well, part of that is because not having had press conferences, not having had true interactions with the working press, and when he did, most of the times they could tell that the things he was telling them was not necessarily true. They were not inclined to believe him. And they, unlike JFK, unlike FDR, TR, he had no leverage. He wasn't offering them anything else. He's just saying, no, it wasn't. And they're saying, well, we think it was. And of course, they were right. When he couldn't prevent them that way, he then, of course, tried to claim it was a matter of national security. He forced his new FBI director to vouch for that. Another set of lies. And these are lies that actually earn people time in jail. You're declaring it's a national security item when it's not. That's perjury. So how did TV and now change how newspapers reported? Newspapers, of course, got to the point where they felt they had to tell more of the story. They had to get all of it. They had to get the depth because you didn't get the depth from radio and from TV. And then I asked the question, what's the difference between Nixon's use of the news and Kennedy? Both of them wanted to shape it, but Kennedy, FDR, all the rest realized you have to trade something. You have to trade insider information to give them the backup for them to have a reason to do what you're asking. And also they had to know you weren't just selling them something. And remember what I said, Nixon got to the presidency by selling it like it was a commodity. They marketed it. And in reality, I think that was kind of how he felt about it as well. All of this was about making a sale, not necessarily about really whether it was true or not. So yes, media changes. We know that. And we've seen that throughout it, but the basic concepts of it do not. It's what the message is that matters, and who it's coming from matters if you have reasons to believe that you cannot trust what that person is telling you. It doesn't matter what channel it comes through, whether that's paper, electronic, audio, video, or text. You have to have a trust in the person that's sending it. Now, I'd ask if the First Amendment is still necessary. Clearly, it still is. And remember, the First Amendment is very clear. Congress shall make no laws abridging freedom of speech or the press, period, end of quote. And in fact, I think around 1962, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, just in his response, was strictly, no law means no law, period. Now, of course, we know there are tons of laws on the press. You can't yell, on freedom of speech. You can't yell fire. You can't, you're still subject to libel or to slander charges. All of these things matter. But I guess I want to say, is the First Amendment less important than the Second? Because while we've seen the First Amendment come under increasing scrutiny and more effort to rein it in the same 50 years, the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, okay, how is that different than no law means no law? Point is, leadership matters. How these things are pushed matters, and who's telling the story matters. And it matters on some very big things, as we've seen in the last 10 years, in the last 20, and here in tonight's show, in the last 50 or 60. So finding leadership is important. It requires insight to correctly define the issues. It requires a vision. Nixon had a vision on foreign affairs. He did not necessarily have a good vision domestically. The biggest part of the domestic one was that he would be president. As a communicator, he was able to share his vision. Remember, he's the guy that gave us the silent majority. That's why he kept talking on the air. He did have the resolve and perseverance to go through. He would have kept going, but it was Barry Goldwater and George H.W. Bush and one other that showed up at his office. And when he asked, okay, how's it looking for this impeachment thing? Goldwater told him, not good. You probably only got 5 votes, and mine's not one of them. So that pretty much sealed it for Nixon resigning. That's one of the reasons he left. But that's because he was not inclusive. He did not work with others for the greater good. He only worked for his short-term wins, and that's pretty big. I'd said those guys were a hard act to follow. It's going to be another 7 years after Nixon before the next master of the media would occupy the office of the president. And that's another story. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's story. I hope you learned something about Kennedy and Nixon. I hope that some of this had merit and value. I've enjoyed doing these. It's been 17 years now that I've been doing classes out here. And I'm hoping for another 17. I'm kind of thinking that's pushing it, but I'll take at least another 8. Okay, so let's try it. And again, a special thank you to Dr. Dunker. I'd like to open this up to questions. I know I'm running just a little bit late. I've been really good this term, though. I've really come close to hitting the numbers. So with all of that, I'm going to open this up, and I hope you're all still there.
Good job, Russ. I want to say well done. And before you get into questions, I do have to drop out, but I just want to say thank you for always being amazing. And this was super interesting. So I'm going to drop out, but thank you guys. Have a good question session.
Okay, can everybody unmute themselves? Do I do that? How does that work?
So I believe at this point, people are pretty familiar with unmuting themselves.
Yay.
And I in fact can't unmute anybody. I can request to unmute, but I can't unmute. And Ed and Cindy wanted to say thank you, Russ, for another great presentation. So,
all right, thanks, guys.
yes. So if you have anything to share, just make sure you unmute. It looks like we do have quite a few people unmuting. So.
All right, yay. Anybody out there? Any questions or thoughts? If there's anybody, this would be a good time for them. Janice, it looks like you're unmuted. Anything there?
Well, Russ, what I was going to say is I've really enjoyed all of this. And currently I am in the process of doing a prohibition podcast, which is quite interesting.
Yay. Excellent. Excellent. Well, make sure you send me something so I know where that is so I can see it. So thank you.
I certainly will.
Excellent. Anybody else? This is your chance. Oh boy. Well,
one thought that I had was that you look back on it, both Roosevelts had a sense of humor, knew how to deflect a lot of negative things with a sense of humor. Nixon just didn't have a sense of humor.
No, he really didn't, and was very thin-skinned. You know, most presidents that we've had in the last, I mean, Clinton was exceedingly thin-skinned. You know, would blow up at a heartbeat at his people, but that makes it really tough. You know, that's very, very hard. You got it exactly right. You'll see that on the link I sent you with JFK, because they've got, I mean, almost all of his press conferences are there, and you know, he's able to deflect those questions that he's not ready to answer by giving a thoughtful semi-answer and then coming up with an amusing aside to shift it off and then pick another question so he can go right on. Now, of course, he couldn't do that with the Bay of Pigs, and that one is also interesting to look at because they do hold him accountable. They do make him answer, even though he said, "I'm not, you know, I'm going to tell you right up front, we're not going to talk about this." I mean, he just comes out. I mean, he's so down and he's so angry and so depressed, and they won't let him off. You know, I mean, they're not disrespectful, but they keep pushing him until they get that statement that actually does deflect them, where he says, "Well, I am the responsible person in my administration. It is my fault." And boom, they're like, okay, what else is there to say? You know, at this point, you know, and he assures them that they will continue working at this. You know, and you know, and it's kind of sad because really and truly, Nixon was an exceedingly intelligent person, and some of his pieces were, you know, far more brilliant than most of the presidents have been there. But unfortunately, he also spent a lot of his time working just as so many of them that we see today. You know, really and truly, you think about it, the last 40 years, the one thing that's been real is that whole concept of promoting oneself becomes the biggest issue. And Nixon presaged that. You know, he did that with so many people, with so many things. And you know, if you really consider it, you know, it is so sad that his brilliance was pushed down by that. I had an interesting experience about 20 years ago when they first opened and got a lot of his personal papers out. That those papers up through his first 2 years in office are so much different. You read those and you're hearing the real Richard Nixon writing these notes. And from that point on, after about 2 to 4 years, suddenly you're watching this, and now you're seeing Richard Nixon, the politician who intends to be president, and what he's writing is now shifted. He's no longer really writing about how he feels. He's writing for posterity. And it's a fascinating, just a fascinating piece. Ed, that's, and maybe it was Cindy, because I saw her with the book. So Ike and Dick, you thought that was a great book? You liked that one?
Yeah, it basically just deals with Ike and Dick during their presidency and vice presidency together, but found out a lot about those two, that they really didn't get along very well. But it was a good read.
Yeah.
And I'm not a political reader, but that one I really did enjoy.
You know, and it's been rather interesting because there have been more books like that now that are interesting, even if you're not into the politics side of it. It's more the personal side, you know, and much like I'm saying here with how personal Nixon really was, and then suddenly just shifted that off. You know, you see some of that, and it makes you feel differently about the person. Now it's very interesting because you go back and read Kennedy's stuff, and it really doesn't change. And in fact, he puts his feelings out there, and one of his last memos, of course, is his feeling on everything that happened in the overthrow of South Vietnam, when, you know, he'd kind of gotten whipsawed by his more junior staffers while the more senior ones were out, and they get him to let them send out a memo that's essentially backing Ambassador Lodge's push for letting the generals go ahead and overthrow them. And when the seniors come back, you know, it was over a weekend. They caught him on a Saturday, and when the seniors come back and say, "What the heck were you thinking?" and they basically try to retrieve that memo, things are already in progress. Kennedy writes up, and that was one of the things Kennedy had fully intended to, you know, he was going to be a young man still when he got out of the presidency, and his point was he wanted people to know what it was like to be president, what it was really like, and thus he too was taping things, he too was making notes, but he would write these memos to himself, and he would record them on dictabelts. And these memos are so intensely personal, you know, because he really felt a responsibility for what happened. You know, the overthrow did happen, and of course, then they murdered Diem and his brother, and that armored personnel carrier. Kennedy was just totally sickened by that, what happened, how terrible that was. And then, of course, exactly 3 weeks later, you know, Kennedy was murdered. So, but it's interesting to see the differences and how honest these people are with themselves, as opposed to maybe, you know, it wasn't just all of us that Nixon wasn't telling the truth to. He wasn't telling the truth maybe to himself either. So big issues. and I hope that in seeing all this, you see how leadership works. And I mean, that is the goal of all this. So I appreciate you. I will stick around and take questions all night if you want, but I'm kind of assuming all of you are ready to go. So if there are any more questions, say so. And if not, I just want to thank you. You know, next week is the cool down lap. Next week is the week where we're going to do our you know, rock and roll piece. I recently, I just did this on a lark, but I'd done this with some of my history stuff, but I was trying to come up with things that I could write articles about lately. And I thought, well, let's look at some of the items that I've done research for, because I have all of my notes on all of these classes I've done. There's 200, be about 275 get done. But I started looking and realizing I had all these rock and roll ones, and I put them all out in order chronologically, not of how I did them, but how they would fit into a history. And there are 50 of them, and they really cover rock and roll from its inception through the first generation, you know, 25 years, you know, essentially. And it's just, I was like, man, you know, if I'd spent the time to write the book instead, you know, where would we be? You know, it could be incredible. But you know, so it's very amusing to me that this class next week, that I've always felt those rock and roll classes at the end of the term are just the unwind, you know, blow off steam, let you. Whereas all this is so intensive, so much research. You know, the rock and roll stuff's a lot simpler, easier, just more fun. You know, and then you realize afterwards, you look at it, you go, well, let's see, what is that? 1/6, 1/7 of everything I've done is on rock and roll. I don't know, man. There's something wrong with that. There's something wrong. I hope you all have a great night. It's been a pleasure, you know, working with all of you, and you know, get some rest, and I will see you soon. It looks like there's some chat messages here. I should probably check. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and hope to see you all next week. See you soon.
See you, Russ. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.